This is the Roundtable at Riverside podcast, a show where we discuss this week's sermon and questions submitted by our church body. We hope this resource helps you see God's Word as living and active and instructive for everyday life. Welcome back to the podcast. This week we're taking a look at Matthew 5:21 through 26 in the Sermon on the Mount. This passage dealt with the issues of anger, reconciliation, and worship. It is likely that everyone knows the beginning of this passage, how those guilty of anger towards a brother have committed murder in their hearts. However, just as important as this is the reality of how anger has an effect on our relationship and our worship of God, as well as the unity of the body. To begin our discussion, I did want to talk a little bit more about anger. The first question we got is, can a brother or sister be angry and not sin? Can you think of any examples of this? And likewise, does anger always lead to sin, or can we as humans possess righteous anger just as Christ did?
Yeah, so the quick answer is yes, I think it is possible, because the Apostle Paul says, was it Ephesians 4, the passage I alluded to, and even read some, didn't just allude to it, but got into a little bit on Sunday. It says, be angry and do not sin. Right. It doesn't say never be angry because it's always sinful. So that tells me there is some sort of context where you can be angry and not sin. Right. And we see that in Jesus. We see that in the times that we see him get angry in the temple, clearing out the money changers. We also see him, and I kind of use this sometimes in funeral sermons that I do, where he gets angry and greatly troubled in his heart, the Bible talks about, at the death of his friend Lazarus. Right. And so in both of those cases, we see this righteous anger where Jesus is angry about sin and the effects of sin, particularly on Lazarus. The wages of sin is death. And so Jesus, a week after the raising of Lazarus, is going to go to the cross and deal with the wage of sin for us. Right. In that moment, we can see Jesus angry over the effects of sin on his dear friends, the ones he loves. Yeah. And even in the temple, we see him angry because those money changers are taking advantage of his people by manipulating them and price gouging all these worshipers, all these pilgrims that have come to worship. And so he sees it's an anger out of this injustice that's being done, and also this anger because, as you may know, that they were filling up the way that the place that they were doing their business was in the court of the Gentiles. Yeah. And so that's the place where the nations had come to worship, but there's no longer a place for them. And so there's a righteous anger over injustice, sin, and the effects of sin in the world. So there could be a righteous anger for sure. Right. There could be an anger over an injustice done to you, or let me just stop there and say, yeah, I think there is a place for that. Right. Nevertheless, I would say that I would be very cautious with that because, I heard one commentator kind of jokingly say, he's heard it before, be angry and do not sin means get mad but don't cuss. Right. Just get a little mad but don't take it too far. Right. Not so the case. So it takes a lot of searching of the heart to see if the anger is a righteous anger or not. Yeah. I would say this, that Jesus, as being the perfect human, emotionally and anger-wise, he's perfect. So we're not. We're greatly affected by sin, even in our process of sanctification. We still struggle with sin, and so I would say spend some good time sorting that out. Yeah. To be sure that this is a righteous anger. Right. So I think there's a space for that, but I'd be very cautious in justifying anger and just say, oh, this is a righteous anger. Sure. Do some searching. Right. No, I think that's helpful. I think a lot of times we do hear just what you're saying. It's either a be mad but don't cuss, or just don't ever get angry, and it's almost this tendency towards emotional laziness. I'm not sure. Not having a response to certain things, like, well, I can't ever get mad. And it's like, well, or I can't ever get angry, I should say. But I think just like what you're saying, there are times where anger is an appropriate response to something happening in the world. I mean, it's a big example, but something like the Holocaust happening, I'm sure there were a lot of people that were angry in those moments of the Holocaust happening. Righteously, yeah. Yeah, and some of them may have reacted in righteous deeds, and some of them may have reacted in not so righteous deeds,
So it could be something that big, or even you and I were talking about before we started the podcast, ethical issues at work. We weren't talking about anything here at the church, but just, dealing with talking to people and having discussions about ethical or moral issues at work. And as a Christian, I feel like that may be a situation where you could respond in a righteous anger where you're like, I know God teaches this. I know that this is not right and this is happening. And it's almost, well, what do you do? But what do you do with that anger? Are you turning it into prayer? Are you turning it into response? Are you turning it into an opportunity to share the gospel, an opportunity to correct a brother or sister that might be falling? Or are you using it as an opportunity to gossip or to further your own anger about it? If it's something that's a moral issue, are you looking at it going like, well, this person did it again. I'm going to keep chalking up this record of them doing all these things, and I'm going to talk about them behind their back, and I'm going to keep, or do you say, no, this isn't right. We, maybe go to that person and figure it out.
One quote that I read Sunday, and I just kind of read it again because I read it at small group as well on Sunday nights, that I thought was helpful. I can't remember where this comes from. It's not my own sentence. I just don't have it cited in my sermon, so I'd have to go back and look to see where it came from. But kind of the test that this person gave was that sinful anger does not bear redemptive fruit. Rather, it leaves us exasperated and frustration. It produces a sour feeling in the pit of our gut. Sinful anger alienates us from God. It does not move us towards act of faith and love and true justice, like what you were talking about. But rather toward acts of selfishness, like sullen withdrawal, irritability, rudeness, being obstinate and bitter. Sinful anger is characterized by self-oriented grief of self-pity, not godly grief over evil. So that, like, kind of what you're saying, what is that producing in you? Seeking out justice, seeking to make it right, or is it just chalking up putting another mark against someone and kind of just building that frustration, that exasperated frustration?
Right.
That could be a clue to you that this is, maybe you're angry over something that is a righteous anger, but you're not dealing with it in a righteous way, if that makes sense. So,
absolutely. I think, well, and even a more modern example of that we can look at is that just kind of what you referenced there. I think it's in Amos that Martin Luther King referenced as part of his movement within the
Civil rights movement?
Civil rights, yeah. But was one of the statements he made was, in quoting Amos, I believe it was Amos 9, or it was in Amos, was that, let justice roll down. And I think there's a reality of like, well, we see injustice in the world a lot. And we're not going to get into anyways, but we see injustices in the world. And how do we respond to that? Do we respond in a way to try to, as Christ did, bring peace to those injustices or resolve those injustices, or do we just merely use it as a point of jumping off point, be like, well, this is bad, let me talk about it to everybody.
Right.
So one of the questions we got in here, moving into verse 22, is what does it mean to be liable to the council? So verse 22, it says, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." What does it mean? Maybe we could look at the three different examples we see here: anger towards a brother, judgment, insult, counsel. And what does he mean when he says counsel? The person who asked the question, I believe, is probably doing some reading in Acts and asked, are they referring to the Jerusalem council? Which I think is good. Like you're trying to make some connections there. What council is this referring to? What are your thoughts? Yeah,
so the Jerusalem council, hadn't happened yet. That happens some years later and is over a particular issue having to do with the Gentiles coming in to faith and things like that. Acts 15. So it doesn't deal with, this is not the Jerusalem council, but it's just talking about liable to the council. And I didn't bring that in the sermon. I remember studying it, but I don't have those notes in front of me. And I believe the council was kind of the highest authority for the Jews at the time. So that's who they would answer to for this sin. So if I remember right, I think what's going on here, and I say I think because I'm not 100%. I'd have to go back and look and do some more research to make sure this is right. But I'm pretty sure what's going on here is kind of this building of not dealing with anger. Is you're angry in your heart, and then you speak out against someone, whoever insults his brother is liable to judgment. So you're going before, the greatest earthly counsel for them. And then that anger produces this just outburst of you fool, just this outright hatred for someone to their face type of deal. And so now you're to the greatest judgment, the hell of fire.
Right.
And so I think it's warning them of the progression of not evil, of anger in our hearts, how that builds to that point. And unless you repent, you have to realize that you will be accountable, just as you would be accountable for murder.
Yeah.
And that's what the murderer would be accountable to, would be judged and liable to the council. And murderers will not inherit the kingdom, unrepentant murderers.
Which I think is important. Coming off of our last question, what you talked about was motivation, and you checking your own heart is having those people in your life where you can say, am I responding to this properly? Did I miss something? Or even being aware. I mean, I do that with Katie all the time. If something's happening, I'll be like, am I responding the right way? Does this seem like I'm coming off in this way? And she's usually really helpful to say like, no, it sounds right. Or, well, you sound a bit harsh.
Right.
Maybe you are mad, or something like that. Just helpful to have that counsel of believers to then bounce that stuff off of, because it stops it from becoming anger that produces a further fruit.
Right, where you become so hardened that you just refuse to repent. And if you don't have a repentant heart, I mean, I think it's 2 Corinthians that talks about, like, you need to test whether or not you are of the faith.
Right.
At that point, if that's how you always deal with anger and never repent and are just constantly angry at people, I think Jesus is telling us, that's the sign of a heart that's still hard.
Yeah.
Take sin seriously. Like in a couple of weeks, we'll see that he says, like, if your right hand calls you to sin, like, cut it off. Rather your whole body go into the kingdom of heaven than without a hand, than
enter hell with a hand.
With a hand, right. And so I think Jesus is getting like anger issues are serious,
right?
And they lead. Even in our small group, one gentleman shared that that anger is the beginnings of hatred that leads to murder.
Right.
Like there's no murder that doesn't begin with some sort of anger in our heart. And so we need to realize that when there's anger in our heart, like this is the same emotion that produces some of the most wicked and unjust things we see in our world. And that's in my heart right now.
Yeah.
So I need someone to give me a new heart.
Yeah.
And to write their law on my heart, the promise of the new covenant,
right?
So that's uprooted from my heart, because that's how serious it is. But a lot of times we don't take it that seriously. We just say, that's how I get things done, or just that's kind of who I am. I'm just kind of this angry type person,
right?
Don't you see the injustice? Yeah, we see the injustice, but also realize that there's a right way to deal with that anger.
Yeah, and I think in our culture, and I don't think this is specific to our culture. I think this is just something maybe we see a little bit more now that we've got such access to social media and things like that. Is it's a lot easier to be mad at people and to create a negative mindset towards people we don't know. It's really easy to get on Twitter, and I don't know who this person is, but they have a view that I don't like, and I'm going to attack them. And
that's it.
When our response shouldn't be, I think social media sometimes can be, especially Twitter, can become a good example of how quickly you can go from disagreement to I want to kill this person.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's a perfect example of social media. And so, like, our brothers and sisters here, and whoever listens to this needs to realize, like, if you're engaging in that way on social media. Like, you need to stop and ask, like, is this producing a hatred in my heart?
Right.
That when I'm dealing with, I know Twitter's dealing with real people. You're just a keyboard warrior. You have that, you're behind the keyboard and have this extra confidence because they don't know who you are. They don't know where you live, and you don't have coffee or dinner with those people.
Yeah.
But is that producing and causing something to fester in your heart that when you deal with people, like in real life, like, you're already harboring anger against them, whether it's their political views or whatever it may be. Right. And so when you meet them, instead of loving them with the love of Christ and trying to share the gospel or whatever, like you've already
you've labeled them.
You've labeled them, and you've already I can't remember. I can't cultivate. That's what I'm getting. You've already cultivated this anger in your heart, and that's what's producing fruit in your life is
Right.
what you're cultivating is what you're going to produce. And so you're producing this anger towards people. So
Right.
I think people understand what we're saying there.
No, absolutely. Yeah. There is a reality that I mean, I'm sure all of us have experienced this at some point. You have a mindset of what this person is, and maybe you've gotten mad at them or something like that. To someone who you don't even know, and then you meet them, and you're like, oh, they're actually a pleasant person.
Right.
What was I do? And I think that's part of it, is that we have to look at, and this was one of our questions we were going to get to, and how does this affect our relationship with man? Is we have to begin by looking at even those who are lost, as what you brought up Sunday. They're still in a fallen nature, just as we are image bearers of God. Like we're not complete image bearers of God because we are in a fallen nature.
Right.
But we are still called that. We are still called, made in the image of God. And so if we're made in the image of God, we need to start with that instead of starting with identity of, one easy way to think about this is Republican and Democrat.
Right.
If you know someone's a Democrat, you're immediately like, oh, that liberal,
Right.
And that's your starting point.
Right.
Instead of starting with the basic, which is they're made in the image of God. Yes, this is their opinion. Now, how do we find common ground?
Yeah.
And you might not. I mean, honestly, you might get to know that person and be like, well, that person, we have almost no common ground.
Sure.
And those might just be relationships you stay away from.
Yeah, that's super helpful, especially in our, like you're saying, in our day and age of identity politics. And we find identity not just in politics, but in all sorts of things that we label ourselves and others.
Right.
What a great word to start there.
Sure.
That we're made in the image of God.
Well, and look at, I think an opportunity for us too is thinking about how did Christ handle situations like this. I just thought about the Samaritan woman. Mm-hmm. Jesus really doesn't have anything in common with a Samaritan or a woman, other than being made in human form, because Christ took on the form of man.
Right.
But yet he finds commonality. He finds these things that bridge those gaps and is able to have gospel conversations, because at the end of the day, his goal wasn't to win a political or social argument. His goal was to introduce the gospel.
Right. Or Samaritans right or Jews right about the place they worship.
He's like, well, get away from that.
Right, right.
That's not the question,
Right.
Yeah. So is our anger benefiting our gospel presentation, or is our anger detracting from our gospel presentation?
Yeah.
Are we angry about things that someone could look at and say, well, that points to the heart of God? Or are we angry about things that very obviously point away from the heart of God? Am I angry because, I don't have an example, but anyways,
I think that was just helpful.
Yeah. It's just questions to think through. One of the things that as you were preaching on Sunday, verse 23, that I thought was just kind of blew my mind as I kept thinking about it, is that verse 23, it says, so if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you. The whole thing is you remembering that someone has something against you. It's not like I wronged somebody and that person now has something against me, but that maybe they have wronged me. I'm going out and seeking reconciliation on my own. I'm not sitting around waiting on them. And I'm also not bad-mouthing them. I'm not canceling them.
Right.
But Christ is showing us that he is setting the example. And I think that's what's so cool here, is that Christ, God come in form of man, is telling people, live the example I'm living. I'm living this example right now. I am the one reconciling you to God. And I'm calling you to reconcile yourselves among each other. And that just, I don't know, that was something that as I thought this week, it just kind of hit me, and I was like, I got to think on this a little bit more.
Yeah, and that was definitely part of the passage when I was studying last week that really kind of hit me hard, because usually you feel like the victim or what, maybe you are or whatever, that, they need to come crawling back to me.
Right.
Or kind of have that kind of mentality, but like you're saying,
they need to eat a slice of humble pie.
That's right. That, and you kind of wait for them to fail or fall or whatever it may be, because you're still, and then that harbors. So it becomes very complicated. It can be if you don't deal with it.
Right.
And so, just this idea that you're worshiping, and we don't say who wronged who, but we just go seek reconciliation, because that's what Christ has done. He's gone after us. Something that one guy brought out at small group as well is, like, you do that for the sake of, like, it affects your worship because it affects your relationship with God when there's lack of reconciliation among brothers and sisters, and so you do that for your worship. And you also what this person brought out in small group was that you do it for the other person as well, because you know the effects of anger. So if that person is harboring anger against you,
right,
you know what anger is doing to their heart.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus has told us what happens to the angry heart, how it'll even, as someone else brought out to me after the sermon, it's like self-murder. When you harbor that in your heart, like that's killing you.
Right.
If you don't deal with it.
Yeah.
Because it's leading to judgment and the hell of fire. Like that's killing you.
Right.
So you see your brother, and even if they're angry at you, maybe for an unjust reason, but they're harboring that anger and you know it, maybe you go after them, not only for the sake of your worship and to resolve that, but out of love for them. Like you're saying, Christ comes after us,
right,
not because he needed something, but because he was exactly what we needed for our healing and restoration. And so he comes after us. So we want that. We want that. So we care about that person, not just ourselves. We care about that person as well.
Right.
That's harboring the anger. And sometimes that gets kind of tricky, because sometimes the person that's angry with you might not want to talk to you.
Yeah.
And so you might have to seek wisdom. So more asking the question, am I doing, as the Bible talks about, doing everything in my own power, or by the power of the Spirit, I should say, to live peaceably with all?
Right.
Like, have I done everything I can possibly do at this point in order to do that? And that may mean that, you may not, you may seek them right away. Like, I'm at worship, God's convicting me. And so what should I do? Do they just need to be left alone and they're kind of sorting, they're not ready to talk to me yet? And so you don't want to poke the fire necessarily, but I think you need to do everything you can, by every means that you can, to deal with that as much as you can.
Right.
Because ultimately they might harbor that in their heart. You can't change their heart, ultimately. So.
Yeah, and knowing when to say, like just what you're saying, when to say enough is enough, and just kind of say, well, I can't keep. There's going to come a point. Let's say somebody is not willing to be reconciled, or there's a relationship where they're still holding on to something. There will come a point where you will become a sounding gong, and that's just it. You're just it's annoying, and it almost might become more detrimental to y'all's hopeful, fruitful relationship in the end for you to keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
Yeah.
I know I've had relationships in my own life where that's happened, where I've been like, no, we need to be reconciled. And it's like, this is not, we got to calm this down.
Yeah.
As you were talking, it made me think about, it's just because I have kids. There's an episode of Daniel Tiger where Miss Elena does something to Daniel Tiger, and she's apologizing in her way. And she's, yelling, "I'm sorry." There, I said, "I'm sorry." And it's like, but he needed something more or whatever. And that might be the case where you might do something in your way, but they might need some, they might even say like, "Well, I'm gonna need a little while to think about this."
Right.
Or they might not yet be ready to forgive in that moment. And so being willing to say like, "Okay, I've just what you're saying. I've done what I can do." Right. And then leaving it at that, not talking about it to other people, not bringing it up in conversation. And maybe even it becomes one of those things where between the two of you, it just, all right, we've said it, it's done. We're never talking about this again. Right. Just because you don't want it to continue to become a festering point. Yeah. Because both of y'all might have done something, or one of you might have done something that you're ashamed of. And to constantly bring that up might damage that relationship. Yeah. And ultimately, I think all of this works against the unity of the body. Yeah. And that's one of the things I think Christ is working towards, is the unity of the body and the glory of God, the worship of God. Because if we're attacking one another, then we're destroying unity. And if we're attacking one another, we're destroying that relationship before God. And I think it's very pointed that he says, leave your gift there before the altar, go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Paul mentions this elsewhere when he talks about the Lord's Supper, that don't if you have issues with one another, then take care of that. Or if you are in sin, you need to take care of that. Right. Because those things are divisive, and ultimately they're tearing apart the body. Yeah. And so, but praise be to God that we have the opportunity to work those things out. And it could be something that just, they said, you say you're sorry and you just move on, and nothing changes.
And it takes great humility here to know the seriousness of anger. And I think it takes great humility to say, like, if I have angered someone and someone holds that against me, but's not willing to come and talk to me and reconcile it quickly and try to reconcile it, I may not know what I've done.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So it
Right.
takes great humility. Like if you've been hurt by anger, or you're angry towards someone because they've done something to you that's hurt you, but you don't necessarily see it, because we have to realize that all of us are still struggling through sanctification to be more like Christ.
Yep.
And so we still have weak spots and blind spots.
Yeah.
And so you have to be willing to kind of go to someone and say, like, you've angered me because of this,
Right.
or that, or the other, and not just harbor it and wait for them to figure out what they did to you.
Right.
They might not even know if they did anything to you.
Yeah.
You might need to be humble to say, yeah, they did this, but they did that for a right reason, and
Right.
I was mad at them, but they really had good reason for it. So all that to say, it kind of gets into like a tangled web that you have to be willing to say, let's talk.
Yeah.
I'm willing to hear your side, and not just being, I'm going to win this conversation and tell me why I'm right, you're wrong,
Right.
whatever.
Right.
To have a productive conversation about it. So anyway.
And I think definitely more quickly than later.
Right.
Not to say you maybe you do need some time for both of you to cool off, or for that person to cool off. But again,
Yeah.
like what you're saying, you could bring up to somebody and be like, "Hey, I feel like this is a pressure point between us," and they might say, "Oh, I never even thought about that."
Yeah.
Or they might say, "No, I don't think so. I
Right.
think we're good."
Right. Like
which is like best case scenario.
Right. Like I never saw that. And that's just kind of like just a personality trait or some way I carry myself
Right.
that gives bad nonverbal communication. My bad. I didn't know I was doing that.
Right.
Or whatever else. And, yeah, because you see it like even like something between a husband and wife. If you don't deal with the issue, you might find yourself months or years down the road, like low key, like frustrated with each other over something, and you don't even know why anymore,
Right.
Because you never dealt with it. Then you forgot what the true issue was, and now you just kind of hate the person,
Right.
Or have maybe you're just angry at the person
Right.
over something. So if you don't deal with it, a lot of times just what do y'all have against each other? I don't know, because we didn't deal. And so
Right.
it just festers until you forget the point, and it just becomes a mess. And so for the sake of your worship, for the sake of yourself, for the sake of your brother, anger is a serious thing. So deal with it.
Be reconciled.
Be reconciled.
Well, we hope this podcast has helped everyone as we've thought through anger, we've thought through reconciliation, we've thought through worship as well. How anger, there are possibilities for us to be angry but not sin, but we need to be aware of those moments and be willing to also say with critically, I'm a human, I could be failing. Let me analyze this. If you have any questions that you'd like to hear our thoughts on, email your questions to questions@riversidelife.org. And we hope this podcast helps you to grow in your walk with God, striving side by side for the gospel of Jesus Christ.
All right.